Hey people, it's Niles talking. Now I want to preface this. I want to do this video because in a lot of cases when you see the coverage of the Great Migration, they portray it as a net positive. Like people talk about, well, because of this, black people had better opportunities and they rechanged the nation and created Chicago jazz and a black district. It's all very whitewashed and it's very disgusting because when you have people, 6 million of whom, as many people as died in the Holocaust, leaving their homes because of economic oppression, because of violence, terrorism, and being so unsafe that leaving everything they knew and everything they'd ever grown up behind was a better option. To say that this is some kind of net benefit, in the same way that people talk about the supposed myth of black people becoming more athletic because of slavery, as one rapper once put it, the sideways gift of slavery, is very sick and people need to know it for what it is, a refugee crisis created by terrorism and economic oppression. Anyway, this is from the Smithsonian. Let's go. The long-lasting legacy of the Great Migration. When millions of African Americans fled the South in search of a better life, they remade the nation in ways that are still being felt. In 1963, the American mathematician Edward Lorenz, taking a measure of the Earth's atmosphere in a laboratory that was seen far removed from the social upheavals of the time, set forth the theory that a single flap of a seagull's wings could redirect the path of a tornado on another continent, that it could in fact be enough to alter the course of the weather forever, and that though the theory was then new and untested, the most recent evidence would seem to favor the seagulls. At that moment in American history, the country had reached a turning point in a fight for racial justice that had been building for decades. This was the year of the killing of Medgar Evers in Mississippi, of the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, of Governor George Wallace blocking black students at the schoolhouse door of the University of Alabama, the year of the March on Washington, of Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, and his letter from Birmingham jail. By then, millions of African Americans had already testified with their bodies to the repression they had endured in the Jim Crow South by defecting to the North and West in what became known as the Great Migration. They are fleeing a world where they were restricted to the most menial of jobs, underpaid if paid at all, and frequently barred from voting. Between 1880 and 1950, an African American was lynched more than once a week for some perceived breach of the racial hierarchy. That never stopped, it's just changed to police shootings. They left as though they were fleeing some curse, wrote the scholar Emmett J. Scott, an observer of the early years of migration. They were willing to make almost any sacrifice to obtain a railroad ticket, and they left with the intention of staying. The migration began like the flap of a seagull's wings as a revelant of black families escaping Selma, Alabama, in the winter of 1916. Their quiet departure was scarcely noticed except for a single paragraph in the Chicago Defender, to whom they confided that the treatment doesn't warrant staying. The rivulet would become rapids, which grew into a flood of 6 million people journeying out of the South over the course of 6 decades. They were seeking political asylum within the borders of their own country, not unlike refugees in other parts of the world fleeing famine, war, and pestilence. Until that moment, and from the time of their arrival on these shores, the vast majority of African Americans had been confined to the South, at the bottom of a feudal social order, at the mercy of slaveholders and their descendants, and often violent vigilantes. The Great Migration was the first big step that the nation's servant class ever took without asking. Oftentimes, actually, it should be changed from servant class to prisoner class. Servants have the implied that they are paid and are willingly partaking in this. Oftentimes, just to go away is one of the most aggressive things that a person can do, wrote John Dollard, an anthropologist studying the racial caste system of the South in the 1930s. And if the means of expressing discontent are limited, as in this case, it is one of the few ways in which pressure can be put on. The refugees could not know what was in store for them and for their descendants at their destination, or what effect their exodus would have on the country. But by their actions, they would reshape the social and political geography of every city they fled to. When the migration began, 90% of all African Americans were living in the South. By the time it was over in the 1970s, 47% of all African Americans were living in the North and West. A rural people had become urban, and a southern people had spread themselves all over the nation. Merely by leaving, African Americans will get to participate in democracy, and by their presence, force the North to pay attention to their injustices in the South and the increasingly organized fight against these injustices. By leaving, they would change the course of their lives and those of their children. They would become Richard Wright, the novelist, instead of Richard Wright, the sharecropper. They would become John Coltrane, jazz musician, instead of Taylor, Bill Russell, NBA pioneer, instead of paper mill worker, Zora Neale Hurston, beloved folklorist, instead of maidservant. The children of the Great Migration will reshape professions that, had their families not left, may never have been open to them, from sports and music to literature and art. Miles Davis, Ralph Ellison, Toni Morrison, August Wilson, Jacob Lawrence, Diana Ross, Tupac Shakur, Prince, Michael Jackson, Shonda Rhimes, Venus and Serena Williams, and countless others. The people who migrated would become the forebearers of most African Americans born in the Northwest. Now that I mentioned the Williams, I want to just bring it up. When I read Richard Williams' book, which I do recommend to any D1 young black American listening, his mother had said to him, it doesn't matter where you go, it's going to be the same. And Richard Williams remarked that it was. It's just that the discrimination and being an underclass was more hidden. Instead of living in a shack and having an outdoor toilet, you had an apartment. But that was still the bottom of the barrel apartment you could get in the city. And being a construction worker was still the main job that you could get. Forget about becoming something more than that. And Richard Williams also described living in Shreveport, Louisiana, and it makes the comparison I call to refugees very merited, because it was like living in a war zone, which frankly it was and is. The Great Migration would expose the racial divisions and disparities that in many ways continue to plague the nation and dominate headlines today, from police killings of unarmed African Americans to mass incarcerations to widely documented biases in employment, housing, healthcare, and education. Indeed, two of the most tragically recognizable descendants of the Great Migration are Emmett Till, a 14-year-old Chicago boy killed in Mississippi in 1955, and Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old Cleveland boy shot to death by police in 2014 in the city where his ancestors had fled. Their fates are a reminder that the perils the people sought to escape were not confined to the South nor to the past. Well, as Neely Wallace once said, the whole world is a system of white supremacy. It's not over there or a bit here, it's everywhere. The history of African Americans is often distilled into two epochs: 246 years of enslavement ending after the close of the Civil War, and the dramatic era of protest during the Civil Rights Movement. Yet the Civil War to civil rights axis attempts to leap past a century of resistance against subjugation to miss the human story of ordinary people, their hopes lifted by emancipation, dashed at the end of Reconstruction, crushed forever by Jim Crow, only to be finally at long last revived when they found the courage within themselves to break free. Well, that's debatable, but let's keep going. A little boy, this is a photo within the article. A little boy boarded a northbound train with his grandmother and extended family, along with their upright piano and the rest of their worldly possessions stuffed inside wooden cages, to begin their journey out of Mississippi. It was 1935. They were packed into the Jim Crow car, which by custom was at the front of the train, the first to absorb the impact in the event of a collision. You see, it's so racist that they even think, let's just try and kill them first. On a bus, they put you at the back, but on a train, they put you at the front, just to maximize the chance of you dying. They would not be permitted into the dining car, so they carried fried chicken and boiled eggs to hide them to tide them over for the journey. The little boy was 4 years old and anxious. He'd overgrown the grown-ups talk about leaving their farm in Argabootla to start over up north. He heard them saying they might leave with his father's people whom he didn't know. In the end, they took him along. The near abandonment haunted him. He missed his mother, who would not be joining them on this journey. She was away trying to make a stable life for herself after the breakup with his father. He did not know when he was here again. His grandfather had preceded them north. He was a hard-working, serious man who kept the indignities he suffered under Jim Crow to himself. In Mississippi, he had not dared stand up to some white children who broke the family's wagon. He told the little boy that as black people, they had no say in that world. There were things they could do that we couldn't, the boys would say of the white children, where he was a grown man with gray hair and a son of his own. And just to say, a reminder of how things have not changed. I remember reading an article or something where a black Florida couple, talked about, well, when our son goes off with his white friends, we need to let him know you can't go around doing things like if they go in trespass onto a property and just go explore, you can't go follow them, because they will, if the police turn up, they'll just give them a warning. They will aim to kill with their guns at you. And it's never changed as far as I'm concerned. It's just the less obvious. The grandfather was so determined to get his family out of the South that he put a plot of land, sight unseen, in a place called Michigan. On the trip north, the little boy and his cousins and uncles and aunts, who were children themselves, did not quite know what Michigan was. So they made a ditty out of it and sang it as they waited for the train. Meat skin, we're going to meat skin. They landed on freer soil. But between the fears of abandonment and the trauma of being uprooted from his mother, the little boy arrived with a stutter. He began to speak less and less. At Sunday school, the children bellowed with laughter whenever he tried. So instead, he talked to the hogs and chickens on his farms, who he said years later don't care how you sound. The little boy went mute for 8 years. He wrote down the answers to questions he was asked, fearing even to introduce himself to strangers, until a high school English teacher coaxed him out of his silence by having him read poetry aloud to the class. That boy was James Earl Jones. I think that's the man who voiced Darth Vader, if I'm right. He would go on to the University of Michigan, where he abandoned pre-med for theater. Later, he would play King Lear in Central Park and Othello on Broadway, would win Tony Awards for his performances in Fences and in The Great White Hope, and star in films like Dr. Strangelove, Roots, Field of Dreams, and Coming to America. The voice that fell silent for so long will become the most iconic of our time. The voice of Darth Vader in Star Wars, so I was right, of Mufasa in The Lion King, the voice of CNN. James lost his voice and found it because of the Great Migration. It was responsible for all that I am grateful for in my life, he's told me in a recent interview in New York. We were reaching for our gold mines, our freedom. The desire to be free is, of course, human and universal. In America, enslaved people had tried to escape through the Underground Railroad. Later, once freed on paper, thousands more, known as exodusters, fled the violent white backlash following Reconstruction in a short-lived migration to Kansas in 1879. But concentrated in the South as they were, held captive by the virtual slavery of sharecropping and debt peonage, and isolated from the rest of the country in the era before airlines and interstates, many African Americans had no ready means of making a go of it in what were then faraway alien lands. By the opening of the 20th century, the optimism of the Reconstruction era had long turned into the terror of Jim Crow. In 1902, one black woman in Alabama seemed to speak for the agitated hearts that would ultimately propel the coming migration. In our homes, in our churches, wherever two or three are gathered together, she said, there is a discussion of what is best to do. Must we remain in the South or go elsewhere? Where can we go with security, to feel that security which our people feel? Is it best to go in great numbers or only in several families? These and many other things are discussed over and over. The door of escape opened during World War I, when slowing immigration from Europe created a labor shortage in the North. To fill the assembly lines, companies began recruiting black Southerners to work the steel mills, railroads, and factories. Resistance in the South to the loss of its cheap black labor meant that recruiters often had to act in secret or face fines and imprisonment. And I want to say something. People talk about leaving Africa. If enough black people left America, they would try and do this. They would simply shut down the airports and the ports. They hold black people, Tijuana black Americans, prisoner. In Macon, Georgia, for example, a recruiter's license required a $25,000 fee plus the unlikely recommendations of 25 local businessmen, 10 ministers, and 10 manufacturers. But word soon spread among black Southerners that the North had opened up, and people began devising ways to get out on their own. Southern authorities then tried to keep African Americans from leaving by arresting them at the railroad platforms on grounds of vagrancy, or tearing up their tickets and seas that presaged tragically thwarted escapes from behind the Iron Curtain during the Cold War, and still they left. On one of the early trains out in the South was a sharecropper named Mally Robinson, whose husband had left her to care for the young family under the rule of a harsh plantation owner in Cairo, Georgia. In 1920, she gathered up her 5 children, including a baby still in diapers, and with her sister and brother-in-law and their children and 3 friends, boarded a Jim Crow train and another, and didn't get off until they reached California. They settled in Pasadena. When the family moved into an all-white neighborhood, a cross was burned on their front lawn, but here Mally's children will go to integrated schools for the full year instead of segregating classrooms in between laborious hours chopping and picking corn. The youngest, the one she had carried in her arms on the train out of Georgia, was named Jackie, who would go to earn 4 letters in athletics in a single year at UCLA. Later in 1947, he became the first African American to play Major League Baseball. Had Mally not persevered in the face of hostility, raising a family of 6 alone in the new world she had traveled to, we might not have ever known his name. My mother never lost her composure, Jackie Robinson once said. As I grew older, I often thought about the courage it took for my mother to break away from the South. Mally was extraordinary in another way. Most people, when they left the South, followed the 3 main tributaries. That was first of the East Coast from Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, and Virginia to Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. The second of the country's central spine from Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Arkansas to St. Louis, Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, and the entire Midwest. The third from Louisiana and Texas to California and the Midwest and the Western states. Mally took one of the farthest routes in the continental U.S. to get to freedom, a westward journey of more than 2,200 miles. The trains that spirited people away and set the course for those who would come by bus or car or foot, acquired names and legends of their own. Perhaps the most celebrated were those that rumbled along the Illinois Central Railroad, for which Abraham Lincoln had worked as a lawyer before his election to the White House, and for which Pullman porters distributed copies of the Chicago Defender in secret to black Southerners hungry for information about the North. The Illinois Central was the main route for those fleeing Mississippi for Chicago, people like Muddy Waters. the blues legend who made the journey in 1943 and whose music helped define the genre and paved the way for rock and roll, and Richard Wright, a sharecropper son from Natchez, Mississippi, who got on a train in 1927 at the age of 19 to feel what he called the warmth of other suns. In Chicago, Wright worked washing dishes and sweeping streets before landing a job at the post office and pursuing his dream as a writer. He began to visit the library, a right and pleasure that would have been unthinkable in his home state of Mississippi. In 1940, having made it to New York, he published Native Son to national acclaim, and through this and other works became a kind of poet laureate of the Great Migration. He seemed never to have forgotten the heartbreak of leaving his homeland, and the courage he mustered to step into the unknown. We look up at the high southern sky, Wright wrote in 12 million black voices. We scan the kind black faces we have looked upon since we first saw the light of day, and though pain is in our hearts, we are leaving. Zora Neale Hurston arrived in the north along the east coast stream from Florida. Although, as was her way, she broke convention in how she got there. She had grown up as the willful younger daughter of an exacting preacher and his long-suffering wife in the all-black town. Wait, I lost my place. In the all-black town of Eatonville. After her mother died when she was 13, Hurston bounced between siblings and neighbors until she was hired as a maid with a traveling theater troupe that got her north, dropping her off in Baltimore in 1917. From there, she made her way to Howard University in Washington, where she got her first story published in the literary magazine Stylus while working odd jobs as a waitress, maid, and manicurist. She continued on to New York in 1925 with $1.50 to her name. She would become the first black student known to graduate from Barnard College. There, she majored in English and studied anthropology, but was barred from living in the dormitories. She never complained. In her landmark 1928 essay, How It Feels to Be Colored Me, she mocked the absurdity. Sometimes I feel discriminated against, but it does not make me angry, she wrote. It merely astonishes me. How can anyone deny themselves the pleasure of my company? It's beyond me. She arrived in New York when the Harlem Renaissance and artistic and cultural flowering in the early years of the Great Migration was in full bloom. The influx to the New York region would extend well beyond the Harlem Renaissance and draw the parents or grandparents of, among so many others, Denzel Washington, Virginia, Georgia; Ella Fitzgerald, Newport News, Virginia; the artists Romare Bearden, Charlotte, North Carolina; Whitney Houston, Blakely, Georgia; the rapper Tupac Shakur, Lumberton, North Carolina; Sarah Vaughan, Virginia; and Althea Gibson, Clarendon County, South Carolina; the tennis champion who, in 1957, became the first black player to win at Wimbledon. From Aiken, South Carolina, and Bladenboro, North Carolina, the migration drew the parents of Diane Carroll, who would become the first black woman to win a Tony Award for Best Actress, and in 1968 to star in her own television show in a role other than a domestic. It was in New York that the mother of Jacob Lawrence settled after a winding journey from Virginia to Atlantic City to Philadelphia and then on to Harlem. Once there to keep teenage Jacob safe from the streets, she enrolled her eldest son in an after-school arts program that would set the course of his life. Lawrence would go on to create the Migration series, 60 painted panels brightly colored like the faux rugs his mother kept in their tenement apartment. The paintings would become not only the best-known images of the Great Migration, but among the most recognizable images of African Americans in the 20th century. Yet through the migration, wherever black Southerners went, the hostility and hierarchies that fed the Southern caste system seemed to carry over into the receiving stations in the New World as the cities of the North and the West erected barriers to black mobility. Yes, this is what I was talking about with Richard Williams. There were sundown towns throughout the country that banned African Americans at the door. That's not only that. When the state of Oregon was founded, they actually passed ordinances preventing any black people from moving there or coming in at all. Here we go. The Constitution of Oregon explicitly prohibited black people from entering the state until 1926. Whites-only signs could be seen in store windows into the 1950s. Even in places where they were permitted, blacks were relegated to the lowest-paying, most dangerous jobs, barred from many unions and, at some companies, hired only as stripe bearers, which served to further divide black workers from white. They were always divided. They were confined to the most dilapidated housing in the least desirable sections of the cities to which they fled. In densely populated destinations like Pittsburgh and Harlem, housing was so scarce that some black workers had to share the same single bed in shifts. When African Americans sought to move their families to more favorable conditions, they faced a hardening structure of policies and customs designed to maintain racial exclusion. Restrictive covenants introduced as a response to the influx of black people during the migration were clauses written into the deeds that outlawed African Americans from buying, leasing, or living in properties in white neighborhoods, with the exception often explicitly spelled out, of servants. By the 1920s, the widespread use of restrictive covenants kept as much as 85% of Chicago off limits to African Americans. And I just want to add, I've talked about this in other videos with redlining. And one of the first towns built using federal funding, Levittown in, I think, Pennsylvania or Connecticut, wherever it is still like 98% white 80 years after it was built. At the same time, redlining, the federal housing policy of refusing to approve or guarantee mortgages in areas where black people lived, served to deny them access to mortgages in their own neighborhoods. These policies became the pillars of a residential caste system in the North that calcified segregation and wealth inequality over generations, denying African Americans the chance accorded other Americans to prove their law. And this is why when people like Barack Obama talk about black people immigrated to America, immigration is a choice, and immigrants did not have laws passed to stop them doing stuff by buying a home. There was no redlining for them. There was no you can't go to school for them. And none of this stuff was ever fixed. It was just like swept under the rug and people pretended it never happened. There was no restorative justice. In the 1930s, a black couple in Chicago named Carl and Nanny Hansberry decided to fight these restrictions to make a better life for themselves and their 4 young children. They had migrated north during World War I, Carl from Mississippi and Nanny from Tennessee. He was a real estate broker, she was a school teacher, and they managed to save up enough to buy a home. They found a free big flat with bay windows in the all-white neighborhood of Woodlawn. Although other black families moving into white neighborhoods had endured firebombings and mob violence, Carl wanted more space for his family and bought the house in secret with the help of progressive white real estate agents he knew. He moved the family late in the spring of 1937. The couple's young daughter, Lorraine, was 7 years old when they first moved, and she later described the vitriol and violence her family met in what she called a hellishly hostile white neighborhood in which literally howling mobs surrounded our house. They always want to talk about, white Americans, terrorism. This is terrorism. Surrounding people's houses and screaming at them, threatening violence simply because they moved in. But that's never changed. Now they just, let's keep moving. At one point, a mob descended on the home to throw bricks and broken concrete, narrowly missing her head. But not content to simply terrorize the Hansberries, neighbors then filed a lawsuit forcing the family to move out, backed by state courts and restrictive covenants. The Hansberries took the case to the Supreme Court to challenge restrictive covenants and to return to the house they bought. The case culminated in a 1940 Supreme Court decision that was one of a series of cases that together helped strike a blow against segregation. But the hostility continued. Lorraine Hansberry later recalled that being spat at, cursed, and pummeled in a daily trek to and from school. And I also remember my desperate and courageous mother patrolling our household at night with a loaded German Luger, doggedly guarding her 4 children while my father fought the respectable part of the battle in the Washington court. In 1959, Hansberry's play A Raisin in the Sun, about a black family on Chicago's South Side living in dilapidated housing with few better options at odds with what to do after the death of the patriarch, became the first play written by an African-American woman to be filmed on Broadway. The fight by those who migrated and those who marched eventually led to the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which made such discriminatory practices illegal. Carl Hansberry did not live to see it. He died in 1946 at age 50 in Mexico City, where, disillusioned with the slow speed of progress in America, he was working on plans to move his whole family to Mexico. And I want to say again with this Fair Housing Act, they'll say, well, we got this. Nothing was changed to fix the decades of discrimination. So all the people who were not allowed to buy their house, they were not given compensation or given the money to get a house. They were just told to get over it and move on and stay stuck in the ghetto. The Great Migration laid bare tensions in the North and West that were not as far removed from the South as the people who migrated there might have hoped. As I said with Richard Williams and his mother, it doesn't matter where you go, the same problems are going to be there. Martin Luther King Jr., who went north to study in Boston where he met his wife Coretta Scott, experienced in the depth of Northern resistance to black progress when he was campaigning for fair housing in Chicago decades after the Hansberry's fight. He was leading a march in Marquette Park in 1966 amid fuming crowds. One placard said, "King would look good with a knife in his back." A protester hurled a stone that hit him in the head. Shaken, he fell to one knee. "I've seen many demonstrations in the South," he told reporters, "but I have never seen anything so hostile and so hateful as I've seen here today." Out of such turmoil, and it's like what Alexis de Tocqueville once said when he was describing slavery in the South. He said, it's great when the slaves are in slavery because he can have as much status as he wants because the slave master can put him in his place. When they're free and can fight and become equal to you and possibly overtake you, that's when the real rage happens. And this is what's happening in Chicago, when black people were actually moving forward and becoming progressive and able to do the same things, if not more, that white people were doing. That's when the violence really escalated. Anyway, let's keep going. Out of such turmoil arose a political consciousness in the people who had been excluded from civic life for most of their history. The disaffected children of the Great Migration grew more outspoken about the worsening conditions in their places of refuge. Among them was Malcolm X, born Malcolm Little in 1925 in Omaha, Nebraska, to a lay minister who had journeyed north from Georgia, and a mother born in Grenada. Malcolm was 6 years old when his father, who was under continuous attack by white supremacists for his role fighting for civil rights in the North, died a violent, mysterious death that plunged the family into poverty and dislocation. Despite the upheaval, Malcolm was accomplished in his predominantly white school, but when he shared his dream of becoming a lawyer, a teacher told him that the law was no realistic goal for an N-word. He dropped out soon afterward. He would go on to become known as Detroit Red, Malcolm X, and El Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, a journey from militancy to humanitarianism, a voice of a dispossessed and a counterweight to Martin Luther King Jr. during the Civil Rights Movement. At around the same time, a radical movement was brewing on the West Coast. Huey Newton was the impatient son of a preacher and itinerant laborer who left Louisiana with his family for Oakland after his father was almost lynched for talking back to a white overseer. Huey was a toddler when they arrived in California. There he struggled in schools, ill-equipped to handle the influx of newcomers from the South. He was pulled to the streets and into juvenile crime. It was only after high school that he truly learned to read, where he would go on to earn a PhD. In college, he read Malcolm X and met a classmate, Bobby Seale, with whom, in 1966, he founded the Black Panther Party, built on the ideas of political action, first laid out by Stokely Carmichael. The Panthers espoused self-determination, quality housing, healthcare, and full employment for African Americans. And remember, this is like the All Lives Matter now. Simply calling for these things was treated as terrorism, and people still treat them as terrorism. They claim, certain people on YouTube and others compare the Panthers to the Klan. The Panthers never lynched no one. They ran schools and fed the poor, but they would become known for their steadfast and militant belief in the right of African Americans to defend themselves when under attack, as had been their lot for generations in the Jim Crow and Jim Crow South, and increasingly in the North and West. Perhaps few participants of the Great Migration had as deep an impact on activism and social justice, while earning the commensurate recognition for a role as Ella Baker. She was born in 1903 in Norfolk, Virginia, to devout and ambitious parents, and grew up in North Carolina. After graduating from Shaw University in Raleigh, she left for New York in 1927. There she worked as a waitress, factory worker, and editorial assistant before becoming active in the NAACP, where she eventually rose to national director. Baker became the quiet shepherd of the civil rights movement, working alongside Martin Luther King Jr., Thurgood Marshall, and W.E.B. Du Bois. She mentored the likes of Stokely Carmichael and Rosa Parks, and helped to create a student nonviolent coordinating committee, the network of college students who risked their lives to integrate buses and register blacks to vote in the most dangerous parts of the South. She helped guide almost every major event in the civil rights era, from the Montgomery bus boycott to the March in Selma to the Freedom Rides and the student sit-ins of the 60s. Baker was among those who suggested to King, then still in his 20s, that he take the movement beyond Alabama, after the success of the bus boycott and press for racial equality throughout the South. She had a keen understanding that the movement would need Southern origins in order for participants not to be dismissed as Northern agitators. King was at first reluctant to push his followers in the aftermath of the taxing 381-a-day boycott, but she believed that momentum was crucial. The modern civil rights movement had begun. Baker devoted her life to working at the ground level in the South to organize the nonviolent demonstrations that helped change the region she had left but not forsaken. She directed students and sharecroppers, ministers and intellectuals, but never lost her fervent belief in the power of ordinary people to change their destiny. Give light, she once said, and people will find the way. Over time, as the people of the Great Migration embedded themselves in their cities, they aspired to leading roles in civic life. It could not have been imagined in the migration's early decades. The first black mayors of most major cities in the North and West would not be long-time Northerners, as might have been expected, but rather children of the Great Migration, some having worked the southern fields themselves. And the man who would become the first black mayor of Los Angeles, Tom Bradley, was born on a cotton plantation in Calvert, Texas, to shepherds Krenner and Lee Thomas Bradley. The family migrated to Los Angeles when he was 7 years old. Once there, his father abandoned the family, and his mother supported him and his 4 siblings working as a maid. Bradley grew up on Central Avenue among the growing colony of black arrivals from the South. He became a track star at UCLA and later joined the Los Angeles police force, rising to lieutenant, the highest rank allowed African Americans in the 1950s. Seeing limits on his advancement, he went to law school at night, won a seat on city council, was elected mayor in 1973, serving 5 consecutive terms. His name would become part of the political lexicon after he ran for governor of California in 1982. Polls had overestimated support for him due to what was believed the reluctance of white voters to be truthful with pollsters about their intention to vote for his white opponent, George Deukmejian. To this day, an election involving a non-white candidate, the discrepancy between polling numbers and final outcomes due to the misleading poll responses of white voters is known as the Bradley effect. In the 1982 election that Bradley had been favored to win, he lost by a single percentage point. Still, he would describe Los Angeles, the place that drew his family out of Texas, as a city of hope and opportunity. He said, "I am a living example of that." The story of African Americans on this soil cannot be told without the Great Migration. For many of them, the 20th century was largely an era of migrating and marching until freedom, by law and in their hearts, was won. It's not been won, it's just a change of the same battle. Its mission over, the migration ended in the 1970s when the South had sufficiently changed so that African Americans were no longer under pressure to leave and were free to live anywhere they chose. From that time to the current day, a new narrative took hold in popular thought that seized primarily on geographical census data gathered every 10 years, showing that since 1975, the South has witnessed a net increase of African Americans, many drawn like other Americans to job opportunities and a lower cost of living, but also to the core of their ancestral homeland, enacting what has come to be called a reverse migration. The phrase and phenomenon has captured the attention of demographers and journalists alike, who revisit the trend after each new census. One report went so far as to describe it as an evacuation of the northern cities by African Americans back to the place their forebears had fled. But the demographics are more complex than the narratives often portrayed. While hundreds of thousands of African Americans have left northern cities, they have not made a trail to the farms and hamlets where their ancestors may have picked, but to the biggest cities of the South, Atlanta, Houston, Dallas, which are now more cosmopolitan and thus more like their northern counterparts. Many others have not headed south at all, but have fanned out to the suburbs or smaller cities in the north and west, places like Las Vegas, Columbus, Ohio, or even Ferguson, Missouri. Even mentioning that is just trolling on their part. Indeed, in the 40 years since the migration ended, the proportion of the South that is African American has remained unchanged at about 20%, far from the seismic impact of the Great Migration. And so reverse migration seems not only an overstatement, but misleading, as if relocating to an employer's Houston office were equivalent to running for one's life on the Illinois Central. Richard Wright relocated several times in his quest for Albertsons, fleeing Mississippi for Memphis and Memphis for Chicago and Chicago for New York. But living in Greenwich Village, barbers refused to serve him and some restaurants refused to seat him. In 1946, near the height of the Great Migration, he came to disheartening recognition that wherever he went, he faced hostility, so he went to France. Similarly, African Americans today must navigate the social fault lines exposed by the Great Migration and the country's reaction to it: white flight, police brutality, systematic ills flowing from government policy restricting fair access to safe housing and good schools. In recent years, the North, which never had to confront its own injustices, has moved towards a crisis that seems to have reached a boiling point in our current day. A catalogue of videotaped assaults and killings of unarmed black people, from Rodney King in Los Angeles in 1991, Eric Garner in New York in 2014, Philando Castile outside St. Paul, Minnesota this summer and beyond. First, the eternal question is, where can African Americans go? It is the same question that ancestors asked, an answer only discovered upon arriving that the social racial caste system was not Southern but American. Well, I've just about reached a limit of my voice, so I'm going to leave this article so you can read it. And I say again, the only place that Tijuana and Black Americans need is their own nation. Peace.